Welcome, everyone, to the NYC Complexity Lounge Meetup. I'm Jocko Solberg, and that's Barbara Frontera, who's been chattering away, and we co-host this meetup. So this meetup is devoted to the discussion of complexity as it relates to human systems or anthro-complexity, but we cover all things related to complex adaptive systems thinking. We tend to take a pragmatic approach in terms of exploring the different ways that we can utilize complexity thinking in our everyday lives, but we also occasionally like to dip our toes into the theoretical as well. As a side note, we tend to talk a good deal about Kinevin and sense making, but we do primarily think of ourselves as a complexity meetup. We're always searching for speakers and guests, so if you have anything you wish to share, reach out to Barbara or myself. Barbara, that is, reach out to Barbara, and we can chat about setting something up with Barbara. We will be recording today's sessions, and we should get that posted in the next couple of days up on the NYC Complexity Lounge Vimeo page. We have a Vimeo page where we post all of our videos of all of our online meetups. If you do get a chance to watch any of them, be sure to smash the like button, as my kid says on YouTube. Smash the like button to let us know how you feel. If you do not wish to be recorded, please make sure your camera and microphone are off. We would ask also that you keep the chat activity to a minimum during the presentation. After Sonja's talk, we'll have a question and answer period, and you can raise your hand and we'll call on you to ask you your question, or you can send it directly to Barbara via chat. So once again, we would like to thank all of you for showing up today, and we hope you find something interesting and or provocative in today's discussion. Our guest today is Sonja B, I'm going to say. Should I attempt it, Sonja?
You are such a coward.
I check it out at the last second. Blignaut, how's that?
Yeah, that's cool.
That's cool. Yeah. Sonja has been working in the field of applied complexity for over 2 decades, and she's a sought-after sense-making partner, speaker, teacher, and writer. In her 20-year consulting career, Sonja has worked in many blue-chip companies and not-for-profit and research organizations. She is the founder and managing director of More Beyond. Recommend you check out the website; it's awesome. As well as the co-founding partner of ComplexityFit. So, welcome, Sonja.
Thanks, Jocko. I much prefer that fancy French pronunciation of Blignaut. In South Africa, we kind of just make everything sound really guttural. So in Afrikaans, I'm called Blignaut, but almost nobody can pronounce that. Thank you so much,
Barbara. Sorry, go ahead. I'll mute.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It's an honor. I'm not sure how to feel about being a draw. I was this morning I was speaking at a conference and I got introduced as a complexity guru, and I was like, I don't think that there is such a thing. So I think for this conversation, I think I want to position myself almost as a fellow wayfinder, and I'm also still learning. So when Barbara and Jocko invited me, I sent them 3 options for what I can potentially speak about, and this is the one that they chose. And I think what I would really love to do today is to not, for you guys not to see this as something that is fully thought out. This is a little bit my own sense making as well, culmination of my interests, I guess, over the last two decades, and also some of the questions I've encountered in clients and some of my own questions. So even if you have a question or a comment while I'm presenting, I really don't mind having a conversation. Let's see how long it takes. If I see it's going on for too long, I'll probably just stop presenting and quickly pause so that we can have a conversation. So I'm not sure if that's allowed, Barbara. I'm not sure how strict you are with your rules.
The fact that you showed up puts you ahead of the game. So anything you want to do is fine with us.
Okay, no, cool. No, I'm very aware there are some really interesting people with, also a lot of experience on this call. So, I think I would like to tap their brains as well. So our topic for today is around becoming modern day wayfinders, or I've coined the term WayFinder with an S, because it feels like when you're in complexity, there's never only just one way to find. So, I thought using the plural just made a bit more, it felt more congruent to me. I'm going to start sharing my screen, and then essentially I'm going to just share a bit of the journey of how I ended up with this thinking and where it all comes from. So I want to start with a poem. Some of you who've watched some of my presentations may have seen this before, but I really love this poem by Antonio Machado. I'll just give you a minute or so to read it. I think what really struck me in this poem was this idea that there is no path, and the path is made by walking. And even once you've made that path, it's never to be trodden again. So this just really spoke to me from a complexity perspective, this idea that all contexts are unique. And especially where we are now in the world, I think we are essentially all in uncharted territory together. And then I came across this quote by Peter Allen. And I've made a couple of assumptions. One is that I don't have to explain complexity to this group. So I'm not even going to go in there. I'm just going to assume you all know kind of what our definitions are. But what I really liked about how Peter Allen spoke about this is positioning complex systems as flows of energy and matter that allow their inhabitants to live, die, and evolve. And that we're all part, not of fixed objects or systems fixed in time, but that we are part of flow systems that has to change over time. And so this also really struck me, is that we're in continuous flux. We are flows through time and space, part of systems that are continuously flowing. And so to have fixed ideas, fixed plans, fixed strategies, makes very little sense. And then also, I really like this 3-domain version of Containment. I've always had a question around, in ordered systems where we know where we are, we know more or less where we're going, and there are maps, there are best practices, we can have plans, there are experts. It's quite easy there to come up with a plan, to define a strategy, to maintain momentum. But what do we do when we're really in fluid and uncharted territory, when neither A nor B is stable, and some, B could potentially be unknowable? And, Dave also started, moving in this direction with, talking about in complexity, we need a sense of direction. We have enabling constraints, things are entangled. And so I was really curious around how to help my clients make this practical. Because what I started seeing is that people understood Containment, they could apply Containment, they had a conceptual understanding of complexity, they realized that they were in complexity. But then when it came down to making it practical and actually acting in complexity, they seemed to be a little bit lost. And so this is some of what shaped my journey. And this is the question that started on me on this journey. And so why wayfinding? And you'll see that I'm going to be using a lot of imagery and also examples from the Polynesian wayfinding culture, the ancient navigators. Mostly it's because most of the reading that I've done on wayfinding has been about that culture, but I'm currently exploring some of the other wayfinding cultures as well. But our maps and our plans are measured and fixed by the past and by what we already know. So I find that they don't really equip us to deal with the future and the unknown. And I really love this quote by Tim Ingold that talks about individuals not being self-contained, and confronting a world that's out there. But we are in these enmeshed and tangled relationships. And as we move through space, our knowledge undergoes continuous formulation, and wayfinding isn't knowing before we go, it's knowing as we go. And so this whole notion of wayfinding, I just found really congruent with complexity, and especially with how to act in the complex domain. And so I am naturally curious, and I looked at various sources and draw inspiration from multiple places. So amongst others, some of the sources besides, obviously, Cynefin and Dave, I looked at the work of Alicia Guerrero and David Woods around coherence, constraints, and evolvability. Sorry, I see there's a double there. David Woods also, he writes about graceful extensibility. I'm not sure if you've read that article. Adrian Bejan, I got really fascinated by his constructal law that essentially states that if given freedom, flow systems will evolve their structure to optimize for currents that need to flow through them. And this really piqued my interest because I started wondering, so how do you create enough freedom for human flow systems to be able to evolve? Because most of the systems that I work in don't have that freedom. So that was also a question that I was grappling with. I have an interest in group relations and system psychodynamics, and in particular, how individuals interact with socio-technical systems. And one of the notions that really interested me there is the need for containment. We talk nowadays in general language about psychological safety. In this community, they would refer to the need for containment of anxiety, containment to enable freedom and exploration. So that's something else that I'm interested in. Anne Pendleton-Julian and her work on designing for emergence. And then I found this lovely book called Wayfinding Leadership by Chelly Spiller and Kerr and Panoho. So many of the wayfinding quotes that you'll see in the presentation comes from there. And then I drew a lot of inspiration, and I just really love this community from the constraints-led approach to coaching in sport. I had the privilege a few years ago to meet up with Mark O'Sullivan in Stockholm, and I was just really fascinated by how this community goes about skills enablement. And it's a complete shift from traditional ways of coaching. They have this wonderful word called enskillment, and it's all around using constraints to create environments where not only learning can happen, but also exploration. And the skills that are acquired there are skills around that's adaptive. It's around creating adaptability and adaptive players. This is a quote that talks about that. And I love the final piece that says, imaginative and creative players are built by stimulating freedom of decision. And this is something that I think is very relevant to our organizations, where now we are looking at how do we distribute decision-making? How do we enable entire systems to become more adaptive? And so this is a space that I've been very interested in. And there are a couple of key concepts, two of which I think you would have seen. Dave has also started writing about this quite a bit, but the idea of constraints that invite, limit, or permit certain affordances, and affordances are invitations to act within what they call the individual system environment. So an example of this could be a combination of where the ball is placed, the constraints around the rules of the game, and also the ability of the players could create a gap or an opening that affords someone to dribble a ball through the opening. And learning in this space then becomes perceiving and developing new skills to make use of these affordances. And so a lot of where this framework that I'll present to you just now, it really works with this idea that if we can manage constraints and create a coherent space where people feel safe to explore, affordances are created that can then, help us discover completely new things, help us wayfind, basically. And in the process, we are also learning and becoming more adaptive. So these are just some examples of constraints in sport. I find this very useful because I personally, I found when Dave started talking about constraints in the context of Cynefin, I found it really useful, but then at the same time, I found that people really struggle to find examples and to make it practical. And in the sports environment, they talk about, essentially they give examples of 3 kinds of constraints. So there are constraints related to the player. So these could be physical aspects like height and muscle mass and motivation, emotions. They talk about constraints in the environment. So this could be playing surfaces, weather, and even social aspects like culture. And then in the task. So this has got to do with the game. So the pitch size, the number of players, the rules. And these constraints are all tangled together, and they create the space, the option field almost, that these coaches use to teach children in particular, but other players as well, how to play adaptively. And I used some of this thinking to guide, I'll show you just now when we get to the framework, how some of this thinking was brought into that, because I found the way that they think about constraints, much more practical than some of the other constraints typologies that I've seen. And so essentially this is my own sense making. I've been it's been evolving for probably the last 4 years. I neglected it a little bit in the last 18 months. When I was dabbling as the CEO of Cognitive Edge, and we had all of the transitions happening there, I kind of left this by the wayside, but now I'm ready to pick it up again. And maybe just to say, this has been a bit of a struggle in terms of languaging from the beginning, because my main objective is to make this really practical and accessible. And so the visualization and the languaging has been really important to me. But it's really difficult to find accessible language for some of these things. So this is the beginnings of a framework. It is still in flux. So I'm hoping that today in our conversation later on, I might get some input from you guys and some suggestions on how it can be further evolved and maybe even further simplified. But this is so the key principles that's built into the framework are listed there. So a key one is moving from the present. I think a pretty famous quote by Dave is to find the evolutionary potential in the present. And then also looking for adjacent possibilities, the work of Kaufman. So it really is focused on being in the present. And, this is also where I think there's quite a strong link, for example, to things like mindfulness, negative capability, but the focus is very much on the present. Then setting direction versus goals, and also focusing on coherence, not alignment. It's very interesting when I work in organizations, especially with organization designers, they get really excited by this idea of coherence. So this entire framework is essentially aimed at creating a space that is coherent, where some autonomy and diversity can be maintained. So it's not about alignment. Managing constraints, creating enabling conditions and designing for emergence, autonomy and distributed leadership, self-organization and multiple parallel probes or explorations, fostering connection and coordination or flow, and then feedback and responsiveness. So these are the key principles. And as we go through, you'll see how they play out. I think another thing that's really important is that this is not a linear step-by-step process. I kind of need to go through it step by step to just explain all the different elements. But you can essentially start anywhere. And it's a continuous mapping, a continuous situational assessment, continuously updating or an evolving process when you start engaging with us. So this is what it looks like. I'm currently calling it the WayFinder, but I'm leaning towards calling it the framework with no name, because calling it the WayFinder almost sounds a bit pretentious. But you'll see it's essentially a set of constraints that create a space, an option field that people can explore when they find themselves in complexity. So I'm going to just take it through one step at a time and look at each of the different elements. And I'm going to use some of the analogy of the Polynesian wayfinders just to create a bit more of an explanation of where it comes from. So the first principle is around moving from the present. So finding the evolutionary potential in the present, adjacent possibilities. And here I got really interested by, in the book by Shelley Spiller, she talks about how the Polynesian wayfinders moved from stillness, and they believed that their canoe, which is called a waka, is stationary under the stars that they use for navigating. So they believed that they are stationary and that the sea or the ocean is kind of pulling, coming past them. And as that happens, they are pulling the island towards them. So it is a process of becoming, not a process of begoing. And what's really fascinating when you read more about this culture, I've just become so aware of just how baked in, all of, these abilities, the wayfinding abilities. It's such a part of almost the spirituality of this group of people. So on the one hand, I'm very curious to learn about them and how it works. On the other hand, I'm also very aware that some of these practices will not easily transfer because it's so much part of that culture and that context. But this idea of being in the present, this is kind of the starting point of this whole process, is where are we? Essentially, where is A right now? Where is our starting point now? And we know that this is point in time. It is going to change. But right now, we need to get a fix on our current location, to use some navigation language. So what signs do we need to pay attention to? These are both internal and external. You can very much use yourself as an instrument when you're on this wayfinding journey. What is the evolutionary potential with where we are right now? And are there some adjacent possibilities we can see from where we are? So this is essentially a bit of a situational assessment. It's figuring out where is A. Then from there, the next principle is setting direction. And this is very much around intent, creating a shared intent. And I love, again, going to the Polynesian wayfinders, it's tie your waka to a star, not a glowworm. I think very often we've become so focused on goal setting. I got quite upset the other day on LinkedIn. I had to sit on my hands not to comment when I saw someone posted something on how you can get rid of unnecessary complexity by setting smart goals. And I think we've gotten so almost addicted to setting particular targets, setting goals. And if you have a goal that everybody's aligned to, you almost have no space to explore. That brings that alignment, the linear problem solution, A to B thinking that really works well in complicated domains, but not necessarily in complexity. So the destination is not the purpose. We might physically arrive where we were aiming to, but the intention continues. And so some examples of this, I read the other day of a city that set the direction to say they want to become the most livable city in the world. Now that is quite a broad intent. But the whole idea here is to provide a sense of direction, and setting goals, for example, would be a much shorter term activity once you've established your flow space. I'm almost getting ready to just pause because I think I've already thrown quite a lot at you. I just want to get to the next step. So this one is around managing constraints and creating containment. So here there are two kinds of constraints. And maybe just to say, one of the reasons why I used these words for these constraints is that while I found the distinction between governing and enabling constraints useful from a conceptual perspective, I found that many people got quite confused when they tried to apply it, because it seems, and this is my opinion, some constraints can be governing or enabling, depending on context and depending on the intention with which they were put in place. Something, for example, like a budget could be seen as governing by some and enabling by others. And so having that as the main typology, I found that it created confusion when people started, trying to map constraints. Also, some of the constraints that Dave uses, like tethers and, I found that people, just couldn't really make it practical. So these constraints, this is language that again comes from the world of constraints-based sports coaching. But they talk about functional limits, and they can be extrinsic or intrinsic functional limits. So these are essentially constraints that inhibit. They are limits. If I use a physical metaphor, there's a reef here that we cannot cross. In the Polynesian wakas, they can't sail directly into the direction of the wind, so they need to stay upwind. There are just certain things that's not possible. If you think back to the constraints examples earlier from the world of sport, our bodies can only, our joints can only bend in certain directions. There are certain rules of the game that's non-negotiable. So we just need to work within these constraints. There's not much that we can do about them. So that creates the one boundary. Then the second boundary, I call the coherence boundary, but it's almost like an identity boundary. So if functional limits are where we can't go, or who or what we can't be, this one, the coherence boundary, is around where do we choose not to go and who do we choose not to be. And so very often this plays out as values. In the Polynesian tradition, they see the two hulls of the double-hulled canoe as signifying the importance of practical and grounded values. So they see, they align these hulls, and just the same way that they align the hulls, they align to values. So the hulls are the most sensitive places to board, also to get onto the waka. So it's a continuous reminder to cultivate sensitivity to how values guide us. And so we use this to orient. One of the things that I really loved a few years ago when Dave spoke about values, he would talk about two ways that you can present values. One is to say thou shalt, so these are typically, the platitudes, I think, that goes up on walls, and this is how we want you to be, versus these are where the boundaries are. This is what we don't stand for. This is what we don't want to be. And so it creates a boundary that is really important in human systems. And so together, before I go, there are a couple of other aspects, but knowing where we are, setting a clear intention or sense, direction is almost a constraint that invites, again, in sports language. And then creating these two boundaries, one that essentially tells us where we can't go, and another one that tells us where we choose not to go. This creates a coherent space. And one of the reasons why it looks the way it looks, I've tried to find other ways of visualizing this. Some of my clients call it Sonja's pizza slice or Sonja's pie slice, but it just works when you're explaining, the difference from alignment and all of us kind of exploring in a very small space, to opening up this cone of coherence within which we can explore further and where there are new affordances that opened up for us. So I'm going to quickly stop sharing and kind of see if any of this makes sense so far. And it probably reminds you of some other things that you've seen. So maybe just for a few minutes, any questions, any comments?
Oh, come on. I know some of you have something to say.
Sonja, I love that you put identity and where we choose to go and choose not to go. It made me think of work we did with faculty around this identity of faculty and what they, no one's ever told them that they get to choose that identity, choose what constraints that identity has on them. And sometimes even framing it that way gives them affordances, and I never would have used that word in that case, but sort of allowing them to see that boundary of where their identity chooses, that identity that they're choosing gives them affordances of stuff that they kind of, it's that helplessness. They go, oh, well, we can't do anything. But to make that boundary actually offers them opportunities to make different choices, which that was really resonating with me.
Thanks, Andrea. Yeah, I found it really useful to think about a boundary and constraints that we actually can't do anything about, and a boundary where we can actually choose. One of the clients I worked with, they were a fertilizer company, and they found that their market was disappearing. And I was facilitating a strategy workshop for them using this framework. And it was a really interesting conversation around, number one, the direction. And then where is this identity boundary? Like, what is it that do they want to be a chemical company? Do they want to be an environmental company? What is it that they want to be? Because that will, to an extent, be, it'll determine the direction, but it'll also determine, where that identity boundary sit. And that helps with decision making. So it does give people some sense of agency. Matthias.
Thanks. I haven't thought about this question very much. It just emerged as you talked through these things. So I may or may not, this may or may not be a coherent question. But when you said intent and then you actually used the word star, as part of the wayfinding language, I mean, it reminds me very much of ideas like the North Star, the vision, the inspiring thing where we want to go. So, I mean, first question is that sort of the same thing? And assuming that it is, I think people often resort to goals because when there's just a direction to go, there's so many things that people could do, right? There's so many options, so many probes that could be launched. And I mean, even I'm a consultant, even at a very, very low tactical level, I'm in so many meetings where without any sort of structure, people just talk, and then somebody else says something else that is a different topic. That's also an option that's maybe worth exploring, but it doesn't go anywhere, right? There's no, it never goes anywhere. There's lots of things being thrown out, everything diverges, and then there's no convergence. So I think in many cases, goals are an attempt to set at least a destination for that convergence and get people to actually empower, in some ways almost empower people to act and reduce the whip a little bit, because again, if there's so much, then everybody goes off and does something and starts things, and nothing ever gets explored even enough to merge it back into something that moves us. Can you, I mean, that's where I'm at, and I don't know, I hope the question is coming out what I'm trying to get at. How do we, if we don't want goals because we don't want to set an endpoint, how do we instead translate that into constraints that focus people at least on some slice of the direction, right? Often the direction is too broad to enable productive movement, if that makes any sense. Does it make sense what I'm trying to say?
Yeah, no, it makes a lot of sense, okay. Matthias. And, it's interesting because, this is something that I'm also still trying to really figure out, because what I see is either that people err on both sides. So either, as you say, that kind of statement of intent or purpose is so broad that it does not provide any direction. So a bank that I work with, their purpose statement is bringing possibilities to life. That is so who, possibilities for who? What does that even mean? So that is too broad to be directional. Whereas something like, a typical goal, like we want to double our revenue in the next year, is not really something that excites many people. So how do you make it broad enough so that you open up some space so that people are exploring, and you don't have everybody just in alignment to a particular goal, but not open it up so broadly that it loses coherence? There's a bit of it's interesting, this direction boundary, when Dave speaks and he says, you need to set direction, but it's when you actually try to do it, it's not so easy, because you need to get it right. One of the what I'll get to later on though is if you can set an overall sense of direction for, let's say, the organization, within that, the different business units can almost in a fractal way define their own little mini WayFinder, where they have, goals, or not, I don't want to call them goals, but directions that's narrower and that applies to them. So in a particular system, different parts of the system could be exploring in slightly different places. But it is, I don't know if any of you watch rugby. A book that's really worth reading is James Kerr, his book Legacy, about the All Blacks. Because, I actually drew quite a bit from there as well, because they have an intent or a purpose statement that is around leaving the jersey better than you found it. So there's that legacy idea baked into it. It is not about winning the World Cup, or, that might be a shorter term goal, but they really have this broader intent that motivates them. I hope that helps a little bit.
Yeah, no, it does. And then there's at least 3 follow-on questions, but I see a couple of other hands up, so I'll put my hand back up, and maybe if there's time, I'll get back to that. Thank you.
Thanks, Matthias. Trent, I think you were next.
Yeah, thank you, Sonja. It's lovely to see you again. And I appreciate everything that you've said so far. I am curious to know if you're going to get into, or if you've thought about some of the signals that might appear as you approach that, particularly that coherence boundary or the identity boundary, because the wayfarers of the Pacific had different signals that they could use to detect, are they approaching land or things like that, birds and the movement of the waves and other things. And as I think about your analogy, which I like very much, it makes me think about how do we get a sense of when we are approaching some of these boundaries or in danger of going over them in a way that's going to cause a loss of coherence or something else that is problematic. And I wonder if you've extended the analogy to think about those kinds of signals, or what you might be able to share in terms of your thoughts on that.
I haven't formally extended it. You'll see that I kind of just mention it a bit later on, but typically what I tend to do with clients is, because we co-create this, so we kind of do what do all of these boundaries look like now? Sometimes they realize that some of them are completely missing. They haven't even thought about it, and they need to be created. But then we also talk about what might some of the warning signs be that we are approaching these boundaries, because especially the limit boundary, the functional limits, things that sit there could, for example, be laws, like privacy laws or whatever the case might be. These are non-negotiables. And if you do breach that boundary, the consequences can be quite severe. Whereas if you keep kind of pushing up against your coherence boundary, then that to me is a signal that, maybe you need to relook at that boundary. Maybe it's too narrow, maybe it's no longer relevant. But, that one is a bit more permeable. You can, it's a bit more of a permeable boundary. But I think it's probably something that I should think about is formally extending it. Because as you said, it's really interesting when you look at the star compass and all of the signs and the signals that those ancient navigators looked for, and what might an analogy be in our context, I think is a really interesting question. Maybe one more, Daniel, and then Matthias, I'll circle back to you after I've covered a bit more of it, because maybe some of it will get a bit clearer. Daniel. You're on mute.
I'm unmuted. There you go. It wouldn't be a conversation without one mute. Yeah, so I'm a PE teacher in a sports department, and we've applied quite a lot of the wayfinding concepts. And how then, though? So we have a mission statement within the school. How do you then try and enact that change with a hierarchy? So we can see the benefits, and we've shown the benefits of this approach within our department and the wider school. And we think there's within the schools has a direction, but how do you then work this within another set group within your business or your institution?
Daniel, I think if I had the answer to that question, I would be rich. A couple of thoughts. I think in some contexts, just the disruption and the flux that's currently in the external environment are, in Dave's language, dipping, taking people a bit in a shallow dive into chaos. And they do feel, there are some instances where people have become more open to new ways of doing things. In others, I think the response is the opposite. People are almost they're grasping for certainty, because everything has become so uncertain that they, things that they know, old competencies, they kind of hold onto them tighter. What I do think is not useful, because sometimes what happens is when we face that problem, we become quite negative about the hierarchy. I've seen many people almost demonize hierarchy. And when you read some of Paul Sellier's work, he talks about hierarchy that emerges naturally in human systems. And that part of the vitality of a complex system is its ability to maintain adaptive hierarchies. And so that to me is a really interesting question, is how do you make hierarchies more fluid, more adaptive? And I think it's, if I think about why they aren't, it's very often because we've linked status, remuneration, people's bonuses, all of those things are linked to the hierarchy. If there's a way to decouple them, I think we've got more of a chance to make them more adaptive. But I unfortunately don't have a recipe for you. It's a problem that we face in multiple contexts. It's one of the reasons actually why I created this particular framework, because some people, if you can show them that you're experimenting within a bounded space, it's not a free-for-all. There are constraints in place. You are working in a direction. It makes them feel a bit more comfortable than just saying, we need to run safe-to-fail experiments. But I don't know if that helps you at all.
No, it does. I think we have a very loose mission statement set out from the 60s, and quite an innovative guy set the school up. But then lots of things are open to interpretation, aren't they? If there's a direction, we're going to go. 1 degree at 5 paces is different to 1 degree at 500 miles, isn't it? So I think that's probably. I think it's more of the problem isn't the goal and the intransigence, is probably the perception of the direction we're going in. But thank you.
It's one of the things that I grappled with, and you'll see later on how I tried to solve for it, was if you think of a typical organization, the R&D department, for example, probably have a much broader cone than the compliance department. But they are still kind of within the same coherence cone. So that is where you can have, if you've got environments that are either very risk averse or conservative, or they have to be, they've got a very strong compliance focus within the broader framework, they can set their own little mini WayFinder that's got a narrower scope, a narrower field. But as long as they are within the broader cone, if you want to call it that, they are still coherent with the rest of the system. Don't know if that makes sense, but let me go a bit further, and then I'll pause again.
Thank
you.
You
must also tell me if you'd like a 5-minute break. We've been going for an hour. Would a 5-minute break be good, just to stretch your legs? And I don't know if you do this, Barbara. Am I breaking all your rules?
I find that complexity requires toughness. So we tend to forge ahead, but I understand, by the way, that it is lunchtime here on the East Coast, and so if people have to drop off and things, You can always find me on Twitter and send me any questions, and I'll relay them to Sonja. She is very active on Twitter, so if you don't get your question in, do not despair. We're all, very findable on the social medias.
On the Google.
On the Google and the Twitter. And
Okay.
so, do feel free, if you must leave, just, feel free to drop off, but do keep in mind that this is being recorded, so you can view it later. And also, feel free to send me your questions.
Okay, so I'm just going to forge ahead then. If you do need a break, just feel free to take one. Okay. So back to this. Okay, so now that we've created the space, the next thing that we look at is how do we create enabling conditions within the space? And this is around, how do we create, for example, enabling conditions to explore and exploit these affordances, because sometimes we create the space and then nothing happens. So this is very much around designing for emergence. You'll see that the image within there is almost like neurons. And when I think of, the going back to the Polynesians again, they speak about, a sense of journey and what is required to be able to go on that journey. So it's important, your waka, so the canoe, your vehicle, everything that you need there, having a fit for purpose crew, key capabilities need to be in place, a sense of togetherness. And then the key ingredient for them is common intention. And this is, very often where, it's difficult to define what these enabling conditions are, because it would be different for every context. But some of these, I like to refer to the requisites of complexity, and there are quite a few. I'll just name a couple. So do you have a requisite diversity? Do you have enough diversity in your system? And this is not only, diversity, external or physical, visible diversity. This is also cognitive diversity, people who think differently. This is also core to resilience. So do we have enough diversity? Do we have requisite inefficiency? Do people have time to explore? In so many of the companies that I work with now, people are so overwhelmed and so overloaded. They just simply don't have time for any exploration or anything of this sort. So how do we free up some time to think? Others could be requisite connectivity. Are people able to find each other? There's so many things that you can look at, but this is very much, it depends on your context. Like, what do you need to, it's almost like putting fertilizer into soil, to mix my metaphors here. But this is, once you've created that space, how do you enable people to explore it? This is also where, some of Jennifer Garvey Berger's work, also on, I'm going to use the word that Dave hates, but, the mindset that we need. If people feel that it's not safe to fail, we really want people to tell us what to do. There's a bit of a dependence on leadership. All of those things need to be addressed in order to create these enabling conditions to do the exploration. So this is very much depending on the particular context. So once you've done or looked at this is where, the next one is we need to enable autonomy and distributed leadership. And this is about fostering connection, because if everybody is exploring in different spaces, some are going a bit faster, some are a bit slower, some are exploring a bit more broadly, but people are all coherent. They're going in the same direction within the same constraints, and exploring different options. How do we make sure that they learn from each other, that we are, harnessing the power of the collective, that we are not, kind of all becoming, I guess, incoherent with each other and duplicating effort. So here it's really important to optimize for flow of information, also to have shared heuristics. And I think, this is where looking at how the military does it, could be very useful, because as far as I know, and I might be wrong, the Polynesians did not necessarily, have fleets of walkers, or they didn't go in various different directions and had to communicate across. It was a bit more of an individual voyage. Here it's around, how do we explore as a collective? How do we make decisions based on common priorities, for example? How do we know when we need to stop exploring in a particular direction and pivot and go elsewhere? This is also where goal setting, for example, comes in, because we can have shorter term goals. I think this is partly maybe a way to, look at the question that was asked earlier by Matthias, is within the broader intention, the direction that you've set, you can have shorter term goals as you're exploring in a particular direction, and maybe coordination heuristics in terms of how far should you explore before you check if maybe it's time to pivot. One of the interesting things here is also, on the waka, if you look at the Polynesians again, self-awareness and situational awareness is everybody's responsibility. So we need to be aware not only of where we are, but where some of the others are. Are we still heading in the right direction? Are we approaching these boundaries? So awareness becomes quite key. And what's really interesting is, if you look at how the wayfinders, how they navigated, sometimes they actually had to set a course that seems to be heading away from the direction where they wanted to go. And sometimes that is the most efficient way, or the most effective way. So this is very much around, once you've created the space and you start moving, how do we remain coherent with each other? How do we coordinate? How do we make decisions based on the same decision-making and strategic heuristics? I will pause again just now. I see there are a couple of questions. And then this one is around, sorry, I see, oh, sorry, I missed my feedback arrows. This is the last aspect of the framework, and it's almost, I want to say, one of the most important. So this is around enabling feedback and responsiveness, and this is also a key enabler of coherence. So this is around getting multiple level diverse feedback, not only from yourself. Remember I said you can use yourself as instrument. So it's really interesting to read how these navigators, how they use their own attunement to the environment to be able to navigate. So it's self-awareness and getting feedback from yourself, getting feedback from your own team, feedback from other teams, feedback from the environment, and then feedback from the broader environment and the system. So what is happening outside of the cone? Is our direction still relevant? Are our boundaries still holding? What are other people discovering? What is going on? Are we approaching any of these boundaries? So feedback is almost the lifeblood of this process. It's also what makes it dynamic, so it's not a static process. In complexity, things change very, very quickly. And this is where many companies, where they fail. So either they don't have diverse enough feedback loops, or they're not fast enough, or especially feedback from the front lines of the organization has no way to be heard higher up in the hierarchy. So you'll see there in the second paragraph, what really makes this work is when people, whether on the board or frontline, are reading signals, even weak ones, and feeding them back to others. And that requires channels that enables this flow. Again, I really love that quote by Ingold. This is in an article by Carl Woods, that wayfinding depends on the attunement of the traveler's movement in response to the movements of his surroundings. Where nothing moves, there's nothing to which one can respond. So this is very much a responsiveness framework as well, to enable us to head into the unknown without having no containment and no safety. So kind of creating a bounded space for ourselves. Before I go here, I'm going to pause again. I saw there were several questions because I want to, that's essentially the entire framework as it stands at the moment. So as you can see, it's an interplay of different kinds of constraints, rests on feedback, continuous assessment. And the intent with it was to make it really practical. So for it, I've seen people use it in coaching. So a friend of mine actually used it. He had a big shift in his professional career, and he used it to find his own way just individually. Like, where can't I go? What do I not want to do? What is the direction I want to go in? Teams have used it, and then entire organizations have used it. So it's that was my intent. Bao, I see you have a question. Should I be scared?
No, why would you be scared? No, let me first say that I love the creativity that, to me, this comes across as very creative work that you are doing, and I love it. Thank you very much for this. It's stimulating me. And you were just beginning to answer one of my questions, and that is, can you maybe say even more? Because I'm using a lot of the complexity lessons that I'm learning in my coaching work with individuals, and sometimes with couples or even families. So maybe could you say something more about that? Because I'm on fire. I see a lot of possibilities there. The other thing is that in companies, of course, power centers are important. And so I have worked also, like you, in a bank where some functional areas will claim where their functional boundary is, because they say, this is how the central bank interprets it, blah, 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 blah. And then the fight starts because some people say, well, you're wrong. And so there is this fighting going on about, in fact, where the boundaries are. Can you say a little bit more about that?
I'll start with the first one, Bao. I think how I've seen, so people, it's this framework has kind of been free in the world for a while, and people use it in very different ways. What I've seen and how I've used it myself is to counter people's anxiety, the anxiety that they experience when they're in uncertainty. And I found that creating some boundaries and giving them some agency in terms of what those boundaries are, and just helping them think through, where are they now? And I think, so if you ask me what my goals are, like, where do I want to be even in 12 months from now, I can't answer you. But if you ask me what direction I want to move in, that is a question that I can answer. And if you can put in place, if you can show me where the boundaries are, it creates that sense of containment that makes me feel just a little bit safer to explore, because I know where I can go. It's almost like children. They need to know where the boundaries are before they can feel safe to explore. So that's in the coaching that I've done. And I don't do a lot of coaching, I'm more of a thinking partner. It's not really on the individual coaching, side of things. That's how I've seen people use it. And what's really nice is you can revisit it every now and again. So once they've taken a few steps, you can say, well, is this still the direction that you want to move into? Currently your cone looks like this. Maybe we can widen it a little bit. So you can, when people start feeling a bit safer, they can start widening it. But I think, especially with some of the somatic work you do, that could be really, really interesting. I think also that idea of self as instrument, as you're starting to move into the space, what are you noticing internally as well as externally? The boundaries, I think to some extent it functions a little bit similar to Wardley maps, whereas when you at least have them mapped, when you've made it visible and people can see where you've put the boundaries, you can have a conversation around it. And it's really interesting because for some people, even in this form, something that I perceive as a limit, as a functional limit, can't go over it, others see as quite a negotiable, permeable boundary. And that, I think, is quite an important conversation to have. But where I wanted to go after this is, this is the one part of the work that I've been doing. But then the other part that I've been exploring is, what is the way of a WayFinder? How do you need to show up? What are some of the skills and almost the habits of mind and the attitudes you need to be able to go on this journey? And that is something that we're working on at the moment, to create some enablement processes around that. Because if people don't show up with curiosity, for example, and with openness to exploring new and different ideas, and even to let go of old knowledges, then this just becomes another goal-setting tool. But I think
thank you, Sonja.
Is already part the battle one. I saw some other questions pop up. I don't know who.
Daniel has had his hand up. Daniel Lisette, are you still with us, or did you just give up?
I couldn't see all the hands.
I am here, but I put my hand up by mistake again. So I didn't take it. My bad.
All right. Great. And Matthias, did you have a follow-up that you wanted to ask Sonja? Because I don't see any other hands right now. Oh, James, one second, Matthias.
I think he's been up for a while,
Yeah, James, go ahead.
Hi, Sonja. I work in a elite sport, and it's sort of in addition to what Matthias was asking and other questions. In regards to, obviously I come from a context of very specific needed goals, but sense of direction definitely is pertinent. But what seems to me that and I haven't discovered the tipping point, is the competence and the skill level that dictates whether you give somebody a sense of direction as opposed to a tangible goal. I know Dave likes talking about sort of mountaineering in the fog, but it's only if you're able to sort of understand the nuances of the weather or the terrain or the combination of the terrain and the weather that you're able to then say to somebody, okay, let's follow an initial direction, as opposed to the goal being, actually we need to identify within this group of people who should we follow, because there's probably going to be something more pertinent from this person's experience, or maybe in the collective, somebody knows about weather, somebody knows about footwear, so the combination of things might be. I just wondered whether you could elaborate initially on that, because that seems also relevant to the other questions that we heard about today.
Yeah, I think it's definitely relevant, and the thing is, this is, as most complexity frameworks or complexity-based tools, it's definitely not a one-size-fits-all, and I do think, it can definitely still be enhanced. What I find interesting, though, and just going back to the Polynesians again, there's this wonderful story, you can find it on YouTube, about the Hokulea, how they try to, because this is it's a skill that has largely almost gone extinct in a way. And they tried to, there's a documentary on YouTube of how they revived this, and they found the last living navigator. And what was really interesting is, they went on this journey. He was the navigator. They managed to get to the destination with no, they managed to actually, do what they set out to do. So they went there with no instruments. They just followed the traditional ways. But along the way, there was conflict between some of the people who were members of the crew and people who were there as researchers. And when they got to their destination, this navigator just walked off, and he essentially said this entire trip was a failure because of how we acted on this journey. People did not, there's a very strong value that they learn from the navigator. It's not only about reaching the destination, it's about empowering all the others on the waka to become leaders as well. And so I think there's a collective aspect to this, whereas when you are, I don't think, for example, in a mountaineering context, you would ever leave somebody that's inexperienced on their own and say, there's your direction, you go. But it's how do you transfer your own skill? How do you how do you take people along? So there's this concept of wayfinding leadership, so we haven't really touched on the leadership aspects of this. But I feel a bit like I'm rambling at the moment, but there's a very strong value system that sits around it in particular in the wayfinding traditions. And then I think it's, as with everything else in complexity, very much dependent on the context and what you're trying to achieve and what is safe and what is not safe. I think even in organizational contexts, I would imagine with something, for example, like COVID, that just changed everything overnight. We may have been exploring in a particular direction and people were, doing all kinds of things. When the context shifts, we may need to pull all of that in and really narrow our explore space just because of what's going on in the external context. So I don't know if that helps.
It's in a roundabout way, it leads to more questions, doesn't it? Ultimately.
It always does.
It's the dynamics of the group in regards, it's when you got the group or the organization. I think in a large part, if everybody wants to contribute, then the contribution is going to be, for want of a better expression, a sense of direction. But actually, it's the leadership has to come in at some point and steer that a little bit or identify. And I'm interested particularly in how you identify the sensitive directions that might be a little bit more valuable or might offer more insights, as opposed to just wanting to express your opinion. And I think that is context, in sport, working with an academy as opposed to an elite athlete, the directions and sense of trust to enable someone to go off on their own, not on their own, but they're never on their own. But that's the bit I'm really trying to unravel. How quickly do you identify within an organization or a team that sort of that initial beacon to go towards?
So two things come to mind. One is this notion of an adjacent possible. So what is already there that we can see from where we are that might be an adjacent possibility. And then the other thing that just came to mind, one of the ways that I've been thinking about this, if you look at Dave's work on safe to fail experiments, this almost creates a safe to fail context. So the same way that you would determine which experiments we want to run, so what are the hypotheses we're testing? Are they coherent? All of the questions that Dave asks, when he helps guide people towards safe to fail experiments, you can also apply that thinking, because in most or many of my clients, they love Cynefin and they love complexity until you tell them they need to run safe to fail experiments. And then all of a sudden they have an allergic reaction. And this is one way to say, well, let's define the explore space. Like, what is it that we're trying to achieve? What is that sense of direction and where are the boundaries? So how do we know what is safe to fail? And then within that, people can, choose what experiments they want to do. So it's similar kind of thinking. It's just creating a bounded space so that people feel a bit safer. We're almost defining what is safe to fail. What does it mean?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Cool. I'm not sure who was first, Cindy or Matthias.
Matthias pops in and out. So if you don't mind, Matthias, well, let Cindy pose her question and then we'll come back to you, okay?
Thanks so much. Thanks, Matthias. This is amazing, Sonja, and I love this sport analogy. It just hit home on so many points for me. So thanks for sharing that. I guess what's going through my head as I'm listening to you is that issue of power in organizations, and how does this work when there's still so many people, whether they be on senior leadership teams or on boards, that are basically unaware and are in old school mode of traditional consultancy practice where you set the goals and you move, and how do you bring them in? And the other side of that is the people who are working in the organization. And I think you've answered this with the safe to fail experiments. I see that when people are in innovative situations where they get to imagine and think about the direction they're going and where they are, then they go back to work and they fall back into the old way of doing things. So where in this framework are there check-in points, I guess, so that people won't fall back to the old ways of working? And maybe that's in the safe to fail experimenting. I'm not sure.
Cindy, I think part of it lies in establishing, well, the coherence boundary as well as the enabling conditions. That's why, I think one of the values, for example, that we can choose for our coherence boundary, is around, for example, honoring a spirit of exploration or whatever the case might be. But, you are continuously checking in for guidance with that boundary. That is, it helps to make decisions. The other is in what are the enabling conditions we need to create. And it might be that some of those enabling conditions, I'll speak about it a little bit, later on. One of the things that we're really thinking about, a friend here in South Africa and myself, is how do you enable complexity fitness? And there's a whole, and how do you work with leaders to enable this notion called complexity fitness? And it links to things, for example, like being more mindful, being response able, not reactive, but responding to, so there's this whole, one of the things that I'm playing with, and many of these are just ideas I'm playing with, it's why I'm a bit scared of your questions, because I don't really have the answers myself. But, the idea, so Dave talks about sense and respond. And I've been really interested in three capabilities that seem core to me: is sense ability, response ability, not responsibility, because I think that's become a bit tainted. It's almost like who's to blame with responsibility. And then adaptability, or I love Alicia Guerrero talks about evolve ability. How do we maintain those abilities, and how do we work with leaders, meet them where they are, but kind of help them to understand that their need for control is almost working against what they're trying to achieve. And I think just reflecting back on Cynefin, what I do find helps is also to say that you don't have to abandon all your goals. There are still aspects in your context that's very much ordered, where you can have your goals, you can, everything remains the same. But I think people are more and more open to acknowledging that they do need to open up these, explore spaces where, because we are in uncharted territory, and more we're seeing unintended consequences of targets and goals, et cetera, et cetera. So, but it's not easy. The people who are senior in organizations got there. They got the power because they were the best competitors in a game that's where the rules have changed. Mm-hmm. And it's very anxiety provoking for them, so I've got a lot of empathy, but then I also see, the negative impact of that in these systems.
Thank you.
I think this also leads you down the road. I'm sorry, Jocko, go ahead.
No, I was going to ask a question, but you're commenting, so go ahead.
Oh, thank you. I was also thinking about it in terms of the difference between agency and autonomy. Because when we talk about autonomy, that just means, essentially self-government and the ability to act, whereas agency often implies the ability to exert a degree of power within a system. And I think that distinction, especially for clients, and can help move the needle on some of these things. Because, when you say autonomy to people, they think of just people running around, like lunatics. Whereas agency speaks to a certain structure within the organization.
I want to latch onto something you said, Barbara, but I want to give Matthias a chance first.
If it's directly following that, can you go ahead? It makes, probably makes for a better thought flow. All right, okay, then I'm going to jump in. I absolutely, there's so much stuff that came together for me in the last 10, 15 minutes. It's really, really amazing. And I love this idea of the complexity fitness, because I had sort of been struggling with the distinction between, well, I mean, in complexity, nothing is firm. You can't make any plans. Everything is moving. I'm a consultant. That's a really hard sell. And I mean, you were speaking to that, right? People really don't like that. They like the ideas, and then you get into the consequences and they get really scared off. And so this idea that there's both the mindset, the openness to curiosity, and I think that ties in a little bit with that insecurity around, power and what that power is built on as well, right? Because insecurity is a form of uncertainty. What will happen if I give up this claim to knowing stuff? And then on the other hand, the fitness of like a skill set, there's a certain skill set around how do you do these things? And so what emerges for me, and this is more of a question of, does this make sense the way I'm putting these dots together? I could see tools like, I could see things like short-term goals or some of these approaches like impact mapping or opportunity solution trees or something as tools that sort of bridge that gap between the way people are used to thinking in more structured ways and the openness that we need, but almost facilitating some of that, showing the different options, exploring within this constraint, but doing that in a structured format that makes it easier for people to follow along. Does that make sense? Like putting a little more structure around that exploration, so that we have that diverging part where we see more options and don't just lock in on the first thing that somebody comes up with, but also give people a way to do that in practical terms. Is that a reasonable way of thinking? Is there a way to bridge those things, or is there that hard line?
I think there's definitely a way to bridge them, Matthias, because, the other thing is, I think part of the reason why we're struggling to bring complexity thinking into organizations, there are a couple of things. I think the language we use, sometimes it's just so inaccessible that people just can't grab hold on it. Also, I think we're really good with ideas, but then making those ideas practical, I think, is something else that we struggle with as a community. And then I think drawing these hard lines and not meeting people where they are. I think the key thing is meeting them where they are. But, for my struggle is, how do I meet them where they are and not leave them there and not act in a way that's incongruent with what I believe? I think there's something that it's so interesting. I had a friend of mine the other day. She just spent a day with an EXCO team. And they spoke about complexity and everybody loved it. And in the end, they asked her, so what's the solution then? And it was like, were you not listening? There's this linear problem solution kind of a mindset. It's why I don't like it when people talk about wicked problems. I wrote a blog a while back where I said the reason why we're so bad at solving wicked problems is because we frame them as problems. Because the moment I say it's a problem, then there's an assumption that there's a solution. If I can, frame it as a pattern. So we're dealing with an emergent pattern. There's so many interacting variables, we can't really, there's no way to solve it, but we can interact with it. We can dance with it. We can shift it. And I think if that is the overall framing, then using a couple of more linear tools, things that give people just a little bit of a scaffold for them to hold on to while you are moving them along. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think if we just dump people into complete uncertainty, we're not serving anybody. So that's why.
Yeah, I've really liked impact mapping in that context, just because it's what I think happens when you give people the opportunity to put all the different options of how a particular goal or direction, it depends on how you frame it. Like, here's all the things we could be doing to get there. And here's all the people who need to be involved in changing their behavior to get us there. And in some ways, just having that visualization of all the options makes it actually in some ways easier for people to understand, to get away from this idea of a linear path. Because if there's so many legitimate options, some of them are more promising than others, but you sort of automatically understand that you're probably going to have to try which ones work best and which ones, have what kind of impact. And so I found that to be occasionally a good way to, like you said, move people further away from this super deterministic thinking to at least an options thinking, which is kind of getting us in, somewhere closer to what this is. That's so thank you so much. This has really connected a lot of dots for me, and I love this idea of the complexity fitness and how to frame that. So thanks a lot. That's great.
Cool. I'm glad. Jocko.
Hi. Am I on mute? Mine's a softball question, so don't worry. I liked the cone and the fact that you have the goal or the direction as being an arc. rather than a line, because the graphic of the sub goals being that they're moving towards the goal, but they might be moving to different parts of the arc. I thought that was brilliant. That really changes the way, because I've been railing against alignment, and that sort of illustrates that it's not just purely about alignment. It's about what my actual question is, which is, I also tend to view goals more from the perspective of being attractors, assuming for the moment that a attractor doesn't have to be a point. But if it didn't, that changes the way that you view goals, because you tend to view goals as something that you're driving towards rather than a attractor, which is something that you're pulled towards. Because if you have a goal that people are not drawn towards, it's probably not very likely to be very successful. So I was wondering if you could comment on it. Is there any differences in your mind between attractors and goals or directions, or are they do they kind of equate?
You know, there's one answer that's always right in complexity, right? And it's like, it depends. Jocko, I think if you see the goal in the way that you described, then it can function in that way, you know, like an attractor. In most of the companies where I work, people don't see goals like that, and they don't treat them like that. You know, they become targets. They become they become rigid. You know, so it's something I'm measured against, not necessarily something I'm attracted towards. You know, and this is always a difficulty for me. You know, it's do I need to do the hard work to try and reframe how people see goals, or do I just find a different word all together? You know, it's almost, there's some words that just become so tainted. Even the word, you know, I've been a bit on this on a bit of a soapbox about words like accountability and responsibility, because I believe they've become tainted. You know, it's all about who's to blame when things go wrong. You know, it's not about giving an account or having a responsibility. But it's such hard work to reframe these things. So I don't know. I think, yeah, I don't know. I think people are just addicted to goals and targets. And it's creating a lot of unintended consequences. And, you know, the thing is, it's not necessarily always about setting goals. You know, it's actually one of the reasons why I created this framework was because I got really frustrated with the Agile community. And all of them, you know, like, you know, there's one way to be Agile, and we shall all be safe, or we must all do Scrum. And in you know, almost all of the big corporates in South Africa are really struggling with their Agile transformations, and many of our big banks have actually, they've just retrenched their entire Agile, you know, team, their transformation office, or whatever you want to call them. And I think part of the reason is they did not create the context where fit for context agility could emerge. And this was one of the reasons why I created this, was you could set a direction that we want to become more responsive, we want to become more agile with a small a. We have the agile values. We know, you know, so we know what our limits are. We have the agile values. We've got other values that we can, you know, all agree on. So we can create these boundaries, but then within that, we can use different tools. We can find different ways of being agile. So you could have an agile organization, but all the different parts could be agile in fit for context ways. That's one of the ways that I was thinking about it. So it's not necessarily always about goal setting. You know, sometimes it's also just, you know, about creating a culture where there's diversity. The other thing that I got frustrated about was everybody saying we must have one culture. I don't know if you find that as well in organizations. It's whatever the company is, it's the Disney way, you know, and then everybody needs to be aligned. It never works like that, but we can be coherent. So we can be recognizable as part of an organization, but maintain some level of diversity. So that was some of the questions, some of the problems I was grappling with that led to the creation of the framework.
Alignment's been one of the terms that I've been ranting against for a while, as Barbara could attest. But I think we are aligned on this, Sonja, as we've been ranting about the same topics. You listed off 4 or 5 that Barbara can attest to. I've gone off on rants on. So that's
and when
awesome.
when he says ranting, he's not kidding.
Hands in the air.
I'm not the only one.
No. So we're totally aligned on that, Sonja. So thank you. Awesome. I'll hand it off.
So I've got a couple more slides. I'll just very quickly go through them. It's a bit of a, this is almost more moving into the, I guess, the softer, the mindset-y. I'm almost afraid to use that word, having hung around with Dave for so long, but okay. And into that complexity fitness space.
We won't tell him, okay? This is a safe space.
That's being recorded, Barbara.
I understand, but this is a safe space. You can use the language as you see fit. We're good.
Okay, cool. So I really loved this idea of what is the way of the WayFinder or the WayFinder. And there's several things here. It's really going beyond the known. And going on voyages of discovery to new horizons. And it involves things like sharper powers of observation, being comfortable with uncertainty, relying not only on rational thinking, but on a broader set of intelligences. I think that is something that we've neglected. I'd love to hear Bao speak about this as well. And that second paragraph, everyone on the walker has to have an alertness of mind, wakefulness in the heart, attuned in the spirit and grounded in the belly. I think it's Edgar Morin. He wrote that we need to go beyond a cognitive understanding of complexity to an embodied understanding of complexity. It's almost lived complexity. And so I've been thinking about, what do we need to become complexity fit? And one of the things that I think is quite important, and it links to some of the questions that you've already asked, is wayfinders exist on the creative edge of knowing and unknowing. I love this quote as well. They are not only paradigm pioneers that forge new ways of seeing things, but they are continuously shedding their own mental models. So they are continuously questioning. They are continuously, one of the other quotes was, they need to make sure that there's no self-deception. So they really strive to see the world anew. And this reminded me, and I wrote a blog on this not too long ago, they practice what's called negative capability. So John Keats was a poet, and in the late 1800s, he first used this word or this phrase. But it's being in uncertainties, mysteries, doubts, without any irritable reaching after fact and reason. And what I found really interesting with this is it's this essence of being in ambiguity and unknowing, and resist explaining things away. They talk about resting in doubt. And I think this is something that is so difficult, because we all have a lot of knowledges. We know things, we are familiar with particular contexts. We've learned a lot over the years. How can we be in the present and be fully present to what is emerging now without trying to rationalize based on what we know historically, and without almost wishing it to be something that it's not? So this notion of negative capability, I'm still quite new. I discovered it a couple of several weeks ago, and it was essentially in psychoanalytic literature, but now I've come across it more and more, and I think there really is something quite key here for us to become comfortable with not knowing, with unknowing almost. And so these are the 3 key capabilities that I mentioned just now, this notion of sense ability, response ability, and evolve ability, and they are entangled. I think all 3 needs to be present. Evolve ability is a really interesting one, because that essentially implies that some things need to be stable, and then others need to be more flexible, they need to evolve. And so out of this notion of needing both stability and flexibility, it reminded me quite a bit of what you learn in Pilates. If you think of how a surfer can surf the big waves, how they can be in that very unstable environment, they have strong inner core muscles. They've got inner core strength. And that enables the flexibility. And I don't know how many of you do Pilates, but you always stabilize before you move. So there's an inner stability that enables flexibility. And so my friend and I came up with this. He came up with the acronym. And it's interesting. And in the beginning, I thought, this is oversimplifying it. But what's really interesting is to see how corporate clients engage with this. They can immediately remember it. It immediately kind of sticks. But it's this idea of being cool in complexity. And there's quite a lot of depth underneath this. But complexity fitness, we're seeing as meta skills, which, and I don't know if a meta skill is a skill that enables you to acquire other skills faster. But it's courage, it's the courage to say, I don't know, the courage to head into the unknown, the courage to question the status quo. There's so many things that, even the courage to set boundaries and rest nowadays, in a world that is so addicted to going faster and, almost working, non-stop. So courage, openness to be curious, openness to learning as well as unlearning, openness to difference. I think that is a very key one, is can we be in diversity, in difference without fragmenting, becoming incoherent. Observation, this is around, can we notice not only what's going on in the environment, but our own internal responses to it? Can we see anew? Can we, and I think this idea of noticing and observing is really key to becoming response able. So to not just react when things happen, but to notice our own responses, to be able to zoom in and out. I think it's Ron Heifetz that said, we need to get off of the dance floor and onto the balcony. So things like perspective taking. And then one of my favorites is lightness. I think sometimes we can make complexity something that's really heavy. I like to remind people that, you already know how to navigate complexity. One of the most complex jobs in the world is being a parent. Even young children know how to manage complexity, in a family context. And so bringing some playfulness back, humor, holding our own strong opinions lightly, imagination. So what we've been experimenting with one of the local business schools is to create an enablement process around this, where some of the things that you see on the right, that's a bit more faded. We have skill modules that essentially focuses on those things like cultivating curiosity, how to reignite your imagination, how to span boundaries. One of my most successful blog posts was, it had the heading, "It's hard to survive in the jungle if you were trained in the zoo." And I think we've gotten so used to things being in categories and being in silos, and we don't like to span boundaries of difference. So that, I think, is a key one. Mindfulness, just health practices like just breathing, getting in touch with your breath. It links to flow. Playfulness, sense making. We actually use Cynefin there. Seeing the world in patterns, so pattern smarts. So this is something that we're experimenting with. I don't know, I'm not sure, can you teach someone to be curious, or is it more of a way that you are just predisposed? I think we were born curious, but it was taught out of us. So this is some of the things that we're experimenting, in terms of enabling complexity fitness. And this sits next to this idea of WayFinding. It's almost like one of those things that we use to create the enabling conditions. This is just a quote that I really loved. Maybe wayfinding is an activity that confronts us with a marvelous fact of being in the world. And just, I love that last sentence. It's a love affair with freedom, exploration, and place. And so I think this was just a reminder to not always be so serious about things, and to also remember that complexity is beautiful. Complexity is life. I think sometimes we make it this thing, this problem to solve, but it's also, there's a lot of beauty in it. So that's all from me. I'm not sure how coherent that was. I kind of shared all my latest interests and curiosities with you guys. So hopefully you can see it like that. I see Rajendra. I'm not sure if I said your name properly, but you have your hand up. So
yes, very nice. Actually, it's about 11:15 here in India, and I hope I can get sleep after listening to all these, wonderful ideas of yours. But I had a small question actually. See, from all that you said so far, in the last, more than an hour or so, I see that, we have great trouble, in reaching where we want to be. And I get this feeling that probably the goal itself that humanity has set for itself is probably, questionable. In the sense that if I look at nature, we give it very little and a lot comes back, okay? And the very tenet on which commerce is based is you take, more and you give less, which is called as profit, right? So have we set up a wrong goal, and then we are trying to struggle, to find out ways of, I don't know if that makes sense. So that's just a thought that popped up in my mind. Because wherever I look, you give little and, tons of it comes back. But if you take our systems, then we are all setting ourselves up for taking a lot and giving back little. And so does that make sense? I don't know.
It definitely makes sense, Rajendra. And I think one of the reasons why I'm so fascinated with complexity in general, but also with giving people accessible tools to be able to function there is, I guess my hope is that we can start migrating and start setting different directions. And I don't know if it's necessarily a good thing or a bad thing, but I don't think that the planet is going to allow us to go in the direction we've been going for much longer. If you look at what, even the planet has boundaries. If you look at the planetary boundaries, there's some wonderful work that's been done by the Stockholm Resilience Institute, for example. We are essentially, much further along the line of breaching those boundaries. And so we have to start shifting direction. We have to ask very fundamental questions. And I think if we want to find new economic models, if we want to find new ways of organizing and new ways of, what is the alternative to capitalism? What is the, all of these big questions that we're dealing with, I think we're not going to make any progress if we don't learn how to navigate uncertainty and navigate complexity. Which is why, it's such a passion for me to make it accessible. One of the things that we're really looking at doing is how do we take this notion of complexity fitness and things like being cool into schools, for example. How do we really, start, spreading the word, I guess, and creating fitness around complexity in much broader circles, because for it to be in this kind of small community of people who are interested in it, and, it's just not good enough. So I'm not sure if I answered your question.
No, it is like, part of the question answered. And I'll be following you and Dave and all of you, to make more and more sense out of whatever vocabulary, that keeps coming now. So thank you very much. It's been very enlightening.
It's a pleasure, Ian. And I think I'm as I said in the beginning, I don't think you ever really become an expert in complexity. I think those two words are a bit incongruent with each other. We're just, the more I learn about complexity, the more I realize how little I know. And so we're all on this journey. And I think we really, really need to find more analogies, more accessible language, more accessible tools, so that it becomes more of a movement, I guess, and it's not contained in small communities.
Well, and that's one of the goals of our meetup, is to, start spreading the word. So, tell your friends, tell your neighbors. Sonja, you have been such a trooper. I can't believe that we put you through this and that you just stayed with us all the way through.
Speaking of breaching boundaries, this was going to be my transition. But we've gone pretty an hour and a half, hour 45 minutes. So that's been awesome.
Yeah.
You said I have 2 hours, so I thought I'm just going to take them.
Well, and you're welcome to them. I've put plenty of links in the chat to Sonja's website, to some of the books she mentioned. So, knock yourselves out about that. If you, as I say, you should follow Sonja on the Twitter. She's on there, and, hit her, look at her blog on More Beyond, and her writings on LinkedIn. Sonja,
we had a question about that. Sorry to interrupt, but we were asking, somebody asked about links and stuff. Is there stuff on More Beyond that links to? There's plenty of people that want to explore deeply some of the stuff you were talking about, Sonja. Do you have any? Would that be on the website or on the Complexity one?
There are. I'm just quickly looking. I'm actually a bit more active nowadays. Writing on Medium. Mm-hmm. So I'm just gonna give you the link to Medium. So this is the latest one. This is actually on negative capability. So what I've been doing is I blog first on Medium, and then after a while I transition it over to More Beyond. I just found it's more effective to reach more people. So the Medium blog is probably the best place to go for the freshest thinking. But I'm a really bad blogger. I have got weeks go by I don't write, so I'm trying to get better at it. But
yes, but what you do write is actually good, so we'll take it.
Thank you, Barbara.
There's something to be said about quality over quantity, Sonja, and we're fine with that. What else? I mean, you've given us so much to think about. This has been awesome. Please come back whenever you feel like it. Just tell me you want to come and talk to us again, and the platform is always yours.
Thank you.
Just a little bit of housekeeping. Our next meetup will be one of the evening ones, and it will be on October 19th, and will feature one of the participants in this meetup, Trent Hone. So, if you have the ability to come and join us at 6 p.m. Eastern time on Tuesday evening, please do. Otherwise, you can take a look at the video when it's posted. And Jocko, we have to talk about posting the videos.
Oh no, this will be up very quickly, so it should be up in the next couple of days.
And as Jocko's kid says, smash the like button, so that because that gives us a sense of what topics you guys find interesting as well. Sonja, is there anything that you need to say to us before we sign off?
No, I just put it in the chat, actually, Barbara. I did write a white paper on this WayFinder framework, as well as on the emerging thinking on complexity fitness. So if anybody would like a copy, just pop me an email. I put my email in the chat as well. So just send me a mail and I'll send you a copy, or else I can just send it to Jocko and Barbara and they can distribute I don't know if
well, send it to me, because he's not going to do anything.
I will too. I'll send it to you.
No, yes, so that's the way that works. But again, this has been delightful. This has been great. I mean, we really can't thank you enough. And so let's give Sonja a round of virtual applause. Yes, please. Thank you all very much.
I also want to make sure to thank everybody who attended tonight.
Yes.
So thanks for coming. That's been awesome. It's been, we got a lot of people from different places. And we got a lot of signups we're going to have to change our name to the International Complexity Lounge.
Yeah. Global.
He's got big ideas. It's the execution that
my head's growing by leaps and bounds.
Okay, well,
thank you so much for sticking with me for so long and listening to me drone on. And I hope, Trent, your session is also at a time that's semi-decent for South Africans, because I'd love to join.
Well, we'll talk about that. We might have to move Trent around a little bit. He was originally scheduled for 6 p.m., but maybe we'll move it to a little earlier in the day so that everybody else can enjoy it. We'll see.
I will conform to the constraints that Barbara and Jaco provide.
Wow, nobody does that.
You go down that road and that gets really dangerous really fast. You do not want to give me even a little bit of power. But again,
thanks.
Thank you so much, Sonja. We really appreciate it. And everybody, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Thanks, everyone. Bye. Good to see you.
Sonja, we owe you like